Good day. The last couple of hours have seen further confirmation of significant Russian advances in the Bakhmut area, and this seems to be the single most important actual battlefield news from Ukraine at the present time. Now, it seems that the Russians, or rather the Wagner organization, have successfully captured all of the various factories and industrial plants in Bakhmut itself. There's a long list of them provided on various Russian sites. I'm not going to go through it, but anyway, the fact is this is an industrial town, and there were quite a few factories located there, including a sparkling wine factory and, of course, the giant Azom works that I discussed in previous programs. And it seems that the Russians, the Wagner organization, is now in full control of all of them. The industrial plants have been cleared of any remaining Ukrainian troops, and there don't seem to be any significance left in the industrial area. The Russians also, over the last couple of hours, have confirmed that they have captured two railway stations in Bakhmut, Stuki and Bakhmut 1. Now, Bakhmut is an important railway hub. It's at the center of a system of roads and railways that, as I said, have bound together the various parts of Donbass which have been under Ukrainian control. I don't know how many railway stations there are in Bakhmut. It may be that there's more than two. It may be that there's more than those. But in any event, it's now clear that the Russians control at least two of them, and no doubt that they are pressing forward along those. They're pressing forward to capture the remainder. And the Russians also seem to be in control of another structure, another big structure called the Metallurg Stadium. This is a different stadium from the Avangard Stadium, which remains under Ukrainian control and which seems to be, to me, to be the one remaining important structure in Bakhmut outside the western suburbs. Now, there's confirmation that the Ukrainians have pulled back, and they're now concentrating what forces they still have in the western suburbs of Bakhmut, and that this is now the one area of Bakhmut that they still control. And it seems this area, this area in the west, is largely residential. That does not mean that it will be easy to capture. As I said, residential areas in Soviet cities often consist of large apartment buildings, these big apartment buildings that I've talked about in the past. But so it could be that this area, this residential area in the west, includes several such big apartment buildings, and it might take a while to clear them. But anyway, for what it's worth, that is where the Ukrainians are now concentrated. And there's also reports that the Russians, the Wagner organization, have now broken into the large village, small town if you prefer, of Bogdanovka. This is one of those villages around Bakhmut, Orekhovo-Vasilievka, Ivanivskaya, Khromovo, which have been the center of intense fighting over the last few days. And if they have indeed broken into Bogdanovka, then apparently that will also affect Ukraine's ability to continue to move troops and supplies into Bakhmut. That's already heavily restricted. The roads into Bakhmut, as I said, are now regularly shelled, not just by Russian artillery, but by Russian mortars, and can be reached by Russian anti-tank missiles. And Ukraine has been reduced or obliged to use the open fields and dirt roads to continue to supply its forces in Bakhmut, and this is causing increasing problems. So anyway, we will see what happens at Bogdanovka, and we will see what happens in the rest of Bakhmut over the last couple of days. My sense from what I'm reading is that the Russians, the Wagner organization, have not just captured all of these areas in the center and north and south of Bakhmut, but they've actually fully consolidated their control over these areas, except possibly the Avant-Garde Stadium, and which presumably will be the next important target in the town itself. There might be a period of consolidation before there is a further push to drive the Ukrainians out of the western fringe of Bakhmut that they still control. Now, yesterday I said that that there was a report which I'd read, which claimed that the Russians were already in control of 85% of Bakhmut. This inevitably provoked some pushback. Someone actually suggested that the true proportion of Bakhmut that was under Russian control was 77%. Another person put it at 80%. How can I possibly know one way or the other? As I said, I'm in London. I'm not on location. I'm not vouching for the accuracy of any one of these figures. All I will say is this: it's clear that the Russians now control, by a substantial degree, the greater part of Bakhmut, and it also seems that it's confirmed that the Ukrainians have been pushed to the western residential areas, and that's the only part of Bakhmut that they control. And I've seen it suggested that if the Russians do capture Bogdanovka over the next few days, and for all I know, that is the area where the main fighting is going to take place. I'm not, by the way, claiming that to be the case. Anyway, on the assumption that that is what the Russians are going to do, then I wonder whether it will be possible for the Ukrainians to continue to fight in Bakhmut at all. Maybe at that point they will finally make that decision that the time has come to try to pull whatever troops they have left in western Bakhmut out, braving the Russian guns, the crossfire of the Russian guns that, as I said, control the two main roads. Now, what has happened to the counter-offensive in Bakhmut that we were hearing so much about a few weeks ago? There was all that big concentration of Ukrainian troops around Bakhmut. Prigozhin, the nominal head of the Wagner organization, seemed to be very worried for a time that there was going to be a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut. Well, all I can say is this: if there is going to be a Ukrainian counterattack in Bakhmut, they're leaving it very late, so late that I'm starting to wonder whether it's now a realistic option at all. I say that again as somebody who's not a military specialist and who has only very incomplete information about the situation on the ground. But anyway, there we are. So far, no such counterattack has taken place. And I recall that about a week ago, there was a string of reports in the Western media, in the New York Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, elsewhere, about the Russian offensive in Bakhmut losing momentum. Well, as we can see, that is not the case. Now, speaking of that, speaking of the Western media, I noticed that reporting about Bakhmut, about the fight in Bakhmut, has also dropped out of the news. There's very little discussion anymore in the Western media about the fighting in Bakhmut, which I again take as a further sign that the situation in Bakhmut is turning bad for the Ukrainian side. Now, what's going on elsewhere on the battlefields? Well, there's been some scattered reports about continued fighting in Avdiivka and near Avdiivka. The Ukrainians apparently are trying to hold the lines in Avdiivka, but the Russians are said to be pushing towards a place called Pervomaiskoye, which, if they're able to capture, will tighten the ring around Avdiivka. I'm going to make a guess, by the way, that in fact what has probably happened is that over the last few days, the Russians have refocused some of the fighting, some of their forces on, concentrated some of their forces and maybe their artillery strikes on Bakhmut as they work to try to bring this long battle in Bakhmut to a final conclusion. And all other things being equal, which means, by the way, in the absence of any major successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, we'll come to that in a moment, once Bakhmut is finally captured, that's when the Russians will refocus their attention on Avdiivka. They've gained a lot of ground in Avdiivka over the last few weeks. As I said, with Bakhmut captured, they will then focus on capturing places like Avdiivka itself, Siversk in the north, and of course all those other small places like Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka further west from Bakhmut. And that will be the major priority for the Russians over the next few weeks in Donbass, before they start at some point, perhaps in midsummer, the assault against Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, which will be the major last remaining defense line that Ukraine has in Donbass. But of course, all of this is conditional, contingent on what happens with this Ukrainian offensive. Now, lots of reports about this Ukrainian offensive, very little information about it. Today, the Daily Telegraph, for example, was speculating that this offensive is about to begin and talked about explosions in Melitopol. I've seen no reports about anything like that on the Russian internet, by the way. But anyway, who knows? It might be that such an offensive is indeed about to happen. Our old friend Vladimir Rogov, one of the important officials of the Russian-appointed Zaporozhye regional government, has given an interview with the Russian news agency Novosti, and he says that the Ukrainians have completed preparations for their so-called counteroffensive, having drawn considerable reserves of personnel, armoured vehicles and ammunition into the Zaporozhye region. They are ready and waiting for the go-ahead. Everything can happen at any moment, and we are ready to meet the enemy fully armed. So Rogov appears to think that this offensive, this big offensive, what we've been hearing so much about, is about to start at any moment. I have to say there are some issues about this. Firstly, I'm far from convinced that Ukraine is fully equipped to carry out this offensive at the moment. Now, the Russian news agency TASS has done a breakdown of the tank deliveries to Ukraine, which have taken place over the last few weeks. And it looks at the number of Western tanks. It doesn't take into account the much larger number of Ukrainian tanks, of ex-Soviet tanks, T-72s, which are going to be supplied by Poland, though I'm not sure how many of those have been delivered. But if we're talking about Western tanks, I count, based on TASS's figures, 49 delivered out of the 49 delivered up to this point. Well, I've actually seen another figure which puts it slightly higher, 57, 43 Leopard 2s, 14 Challenger 2s. Though it should be stressed that the Challenger 2s will be operated presumably in distinct formations. I'm not quite sure how the Challenger 2 is going to be operated, but anyway, 43 Leopard 2s deployed so far, and they come from a mixture of different batches. They're not all identical, and from what I can see, the Ukrainians themselves, having checked the Leopard 2s, are unconvinced by its level of armor protection, because as I discussed in a previous program, they're now placing explosive reactive armor panels on the Leopard 2, which is probably a good idea, but it was not what was intended when the Leopard 2 was designed. The German army, for example, European armies, NATO armies, do not use these panels with their Leopard 2s. And we're already talking about a heavy tank, weighs around 64 tons apparently, and it will, of course, increase its weight even further. Now, there's no sign yet of any delivery of Leopard 1 tanks, and far from all the Leopard 2s that were supposed to be delivered have so far been delivered. Spain, for example, has postponed delivery of its Leopard 2 tanks because apparently it's only going to supply around 6 anyway, but for what it's worth, it's delayed supplying these Leopard 2 tanks because apparently they're still not in full working order. So we have a commitment to provide 2 battalions worth tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, and that's not been filled. And there's no evidence yet of any deliveries of Leopard 1 tanks. Now, I've expressed some doubt about the utility of the Leopard 1. It's a relatively old tank, dates in the 1960s and 1970s. It was phased out of NATO militaries, well, largely phased out of NATO militaries some time ago. Some NATO militaries do still use it. It's got thin armour. It's got a 105mm gun, which is probably too light for combat today, at least tank-to-tank combat today, at least tank-to-tank combat with more modern Russian tanks, which have 125mm smoothbore guns. Anyway, whatever. There's no Leopard 1s. There's still some Leopard 2s to deliver. The crews have only had a very accelerated training with these vehicles, and I'm not really entirely sure that the Ukrainians are indeed fully ready for an offensive. Now, there's talk also that Ukraine has received more batches of MiG-29 fighter jets from Poland and Slovakia. And there's been suggestions that the totality of MiG-29 fighter jets, which the Ukrainian Air Force is going to have at some point, is 72, and there's still apparently some Sukhoi 27 fighter jets left over from the Ukrainian Air Force which preceded the war. Now 72 sounds like quite a lot, except again I'm not entirely sure whether all of these fighter jets have indeed been delivered, and for what it's worth, the Russians don't seem to be particularly concerned about this. They consider these to be old versions of the MiG-29 left over from the Soviet era. The Russians are familiar with the workings of this fighter jet, and they don't see it as any kind of match for their own air force, which is equipped with much more modern fighters. But regardless of that, it's possible, it's conceivable, that the Ukrainians still need time to get these MiG-29s up and running. If they've just been delivered, they're probably not yet fully ready for use, even if the Ukrainian pilots are familiar with these fighter jets. And I suspect anyway that we haven't yet seen full delivery of these fighter jets yet. So it could be that there's still some time before this offensive begins. But this is just a guess, and I'm not going to pin my colours to the mast on this, as we say. I don't know for this for a fact, one way or the other. We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, there are lots of rumours and talk about this offensive. Now, I'm going to add something else, which is that I've seen a report, or various reports apparently, indeed in, again, various parts of the Russian internet, that though the total forces that the Ukrainians are committing to this offensive in Zaporozhye is around 70 to 80,000. The actual advance force concentrated in Orekhov numbers around 20,000. And that doesn't seem to me to be sufficient for a breakthrough force. And again, I do wonder whether there isn't some organisation and redeployment and training still to do. But anyway, there we go. We'll just have to see what happens. It could be this offensive will start today or tomorrow, or it could be that it's still some weeks away. I'm not going to guess. I also suspect that the weather conditions are playing a significant role in determining when this offensive starts. As I said, there were heavy snowfalls a couple of days ago right across the battlefronts. I understand temperatures have risen. The snow is presumably thawing, but that will also make the ground soft again. And for all I know, that might delay the offensive for a little while. Now, talking about the soft ground, I've talked about tanks and the kind of tanks that Ukraine is getting, and I focused on the Leopard 2s and Leopard 1s and Challenger 2s. The Abrams tanks are still weeks or months away from being delivered and are not going to play any role in a counteroffensive soon. But anyway, there's also, I suppose, the French AMX 10RCs, these wheeled vehicles with their tanks, with their light guns, their 105 millimeter. Well, it's not exactly a light gun, but anyway, medium pressure gun. I gather that Ukraine expects to receive around 40 of these. And I'm trying to work out what they're going to be used for. And the best discussion I can find, the only one that really provides any kind of explanation of what the purpose of these machines would be, is technology.org, and it provides the following discussion about the AMX-10RC. It is not a fully fledged tank. Its armour is much lighter and can be penetrated with light autocannons using armour-piercing ammunition. Wheels lack stability compared to a track-based chassis, and the 105mm gun is smaller compared to many leading tanks and is not stabilised, so that it can't fire on the move, and it's a lighter gun than the 105mm gun operated, for example, by the Leopard 1. In addition to that, the AMX-10RC medium pressure cannon uses 105mm proprietary ammunition, which is not compatible with the NATO 105mm projectile standard. So it's not only a lighter gun, a less powerful gun than the 105mm gun used by the Leopard 1, but it requires entirely different ammunition. So Ukraine is going to have to develop an entirely different logistics line to equip these 40 AMX-10RCs with shells entirely separate from the 120mm shells fired by the Leopard 2 and the 105mm shells fired by the Leopard 1 and the 120mm shell rifled shells fired by the Challenger 2. Brian Beletic has talked about this at length. Again, as somebody who has some experience of logistics, I would say that to me, that looks like a nightmare. But anyway, I'm not going to discuss this further here. But anyway, what can this vehicle do? And this article says, in this machine, the ability to overcome difficult terrain is exceptionally good. All 6 wheels are driven, which undoubtedly does help. And I wonder how effective that is in the very, very swampy conditions, the very soft ground that you're getting, muddy ground that you're getting in Ukraine at the moment. It also uses, anyway, it goes on to say, it also uses the skid principle where the left side and the right side wheels can be driven independently, and wheels are also coupled with an automatic tyre inflation system. All good and excellent, but I doubt very much that this substitutes in any way for a track, for tracks. Tracks are much more effective on soft ground, whatever. And it goes on to say that the armoured vehicle is fitted with a hydropneumatic suspension system with variable ground clearance and tilt. Again, good perhaps, but hardly ideal, I would have thought. The lightest version weighs 16 tons, strengthened version 22 tons, but the overall agility is much better compared to heavier tanks, which makes it a good choice for reconnaissance purposes. Now, I accept that might have been valid when this vehicle was designed in the 1970s. But I wonder whether it has any bearing at all on the war in Ukraine, which is happening over, admittedly, a very large front, but it's going to be concentrated, presumably, in areas like Zaporozhye, against heavy Russian fortifications. And of course, with reconnaissance nowadays, does one really need a wheeled vehicle to conduct reconnaissance, given the enormous number of drones that are carrying out precisely that kind of role? I think, to say it frankly, I really don't understand at all what this machine is supposed to do. Yes, can destroy lighter Russian vehicles like infantry fighting vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, but it does seem to me an expensive vehicle to use for that purpose, and I don't really understand the logic of it. And then this article, which by the way dates from September 2022, before France announced it was going to deliver this vehicle, which is interesting in itself. But anyway, the article goes on to say, currently, Ukraine does not have many options for strengthening the armed forces with new armoured vehicles. And in the case of offers from France, with an adequate number of AMX-10RCs, this opportunity should not be neglected. In other words, Ukraine has to take what it gets. And that brings me to the visit by Robert Habeck, German Vice-Chancellor, one of the key figures in the German government. He's also the economics minister, a major leader of the Greens, one of the major individuals pushing within Germany for support for Ukraine. Anyway, he's just visited Kiev. He's had meetings with Zelensky there. He's now made statements publicly ruling out any possibility of German troops of entering the fighting, becoming involved in the fighting. And he says, this is an radio broadcast, radio interview with Deutschlandfunk Radio. We should not become a party to the war. It is important to always keep our distance. The presence, and he said that the presence of German troops in Ukraine is a red line which cannot be crossed. A German red line which cannot be crossed. And that's from Habeck. Now, whenever Germany has drawn red lines up to now, it's always crossed them, but the Green Party has always been agitating to cross those red lines. It seems to me that if the Greens, even the Greens, are saying that this is too much of a red line, even for them to cross, it's going to be very difficult for Germany, to put it mildly, to send ground troops to fight in Ukraine. And it's interesting that Habeck has had to discuss this in an interview, because it rather reinforces the view that, or the idea previously promoted by Hungary, by Viktor Orban, that there's been discussions within the EU of sending ground troops into Ukraine under guise of peacekeepers. And it does look increasingly as if there are such discussions. And the Germans, including Habeck, are now going out of their way to make it absolutely clear that this is one red line that they have to stick by, that they simply cannot cross. German public opinion, which is already becoming skeptical and concerned about the war, will not countenance it. And I think my sense is that this is one particular red line which Germany will not cross, and that leaves the entire idea of a peacekeeping force entering Ukraine reduced to a limited number of countries. And when I say a limited number of countries, in practical terms, it's only one, and that's Poland. You can think of other countries that might, in theory, do it, the Baltic states, for example. Romania is sometimes talked about. But if I have to be frank, the only country on the front lines which has a sizable military that would be able to put troops in Ukraine in any number is Poland. And Habeck, of course, has said that just after meeting Zelensky in Kiev. I strongly suspect that one of his reasons for going to Kiev, I mean, in theory, it was all about economic agreements. He brought a relatively small delegation, by the way, of German business people with him to Kiev. Doesn't seem as if the German business community is hugely enthusiastic about getting involved in Ukraine, but some businessmen did come along with Habeck, and there were discussions about economic connections between Ukraine and Germany going forward. But anyway, I suspect that his real purpose in going to Kiev was to give Zelensky these two messages: that Germany is now unable to send more equipment. It's run out of what it can send. It lent 18 Leopard 2 tanks. Supply of more Leopard 2s would start to deplete not just German reserves of tanks to dangerous levels, but European reserves of Leopard 2s to dangerous levels. There's already problems supplying the Leopard 1s, which have been in store. I suspect there's still issues trying to find ammunition for these tanks. Anyway, one way or the other, I think Habeck explained to Zelensky that there isn't, in practical terms, going to be much in the way of new equipment, more equipment supplied to Ukraine. And I think he also would have wanted to make clear to Zelensky that even he, that is to say Habeck, one of Ukraine's most passionate supporters, not just in Germany, but also in Europe, has now hit on the red line. He cannot commit Germany to sending ground troops to Ukraine, even as part of a peacekeeping force. German opinion is too hostile to that idea. It simply won't happen. And perhaps that in part explains Zelensky's current visit to Poland. Now, can I just say this is a visit which will have been planned and talked about over a long time. Zelensky isn't just turned up in Poland because Habeck will have given him unappealing, unattractive news in Kiev. More probably, Habeck went to Kiev on the eve of Zelensky's visit to Warsaw to make it clear to Zelensky that if Zelensky is going to be talking with the Polish leaders about peacekeeping forces, he needs to understand that Germany is not going to be involved in them. But anyway, the fact is, Zelensky is now in Poland. And I'm going to say this, I get the sense that even in Poland, the ground is shifting. Now, I understand and I fully accept that there is continued strong support for Ukraine in Poland. Poland has a long, complicated, very difficult history with Russia. It's occupied, conquered by Russia, along with, by the way, Prussia and Austria during the partitions of the late 18th century. It was for a long time, throughout the 19th century, it disappeared as a country. There were rebellions against the Russians in Russian-controlled Poland in 1830, and I believe, from memory, 1862, which the Russians suppressed. Poland finally gained independence from Russia after a long struggle at the time of the Russian Revolution. There was then a Russian-Polish War that was fought in 1920 when the Red Army almost reached Warsaw. And, of course, many Poles still remember with understandable bitterness the events of 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the subsequent difficult relationship with the Soviet Union over the course of the Second World War, the loss of the territories in the West, including Lvov, the Katyn massacre, and of course the long period of communist rule of Poland that followed the Second World War. Even though I would say that I do know several people from Poland who have rather more positive views of that period of communist rule than one might have expected. So this is a difficult and long history, and I just set it out there because I want to make it very clear that I am aware of that history, and I do understand why a lot of people in Poland feel bitter towards Russia and angry towards Russia, and why they might want to support Ukraine. There is a Russian side to this story which I'm not going to discuss in this program. Anyway, suffice to say, I understand that, but I also get the sense that support within the Polish military for an intervention in Ukraine is almost non-existent. The high command of the Polish military doesn't favour this idea at all. Ukraine has already sent much of its equipment to Ukraine, where it's already been destroyed by the Russians. Large numbers of volunteers from Poland have fought in Ukraine, and there's lots of speculation that these are, to all intents and purposes, Polish troops who've been sent into Ukraine as volunteers. There's varying stories and discussions and debates about the number of these who've died. Again, I'm not going to get into casualty figures, but apparently it's enough for it to have been noticed in Poland. There's been an exodus of people from the Polish military as rumours of an intervention in Ukraine have spread. It's been difficult for the Polish military to retain numbers of troops or to recruit more, apparently. And generally, I get the sense that the military thinks this is a bad idea, and much of Polish society thinks the same. And there are now economic grievances because Poland has been trying to support Ukraine economically. One of the ways in which that's been happening is through imports into the EU via Poland of Ukrainian wheat. And of course, what that is doing is it's pushing down wheat prices, and that's been affecting the incomes of Polish farmers, who are, of course, one of the main support bases of the ruling Law and Justice Party. And Zelensky's visit has been greeted with protests from some of these farmers. So I don't know what the present Polish leadership is thinking, but I suspect as they receive Zelensky, they're starting to skate on thinner ice. And I understand there's going to be elections in Poland next year, and these are starting to look like difficult elections, and I wonder whether Law and Justice really can afford to alienate one of the key parts of its electoral constituency, which are these farmers who, as I said, are deeply patriotic, conservative, Catholic people, natural supporters of law and justice, but they're now feeling increasingly unhappy about these Ukrainian wheat imports. And of course, the last period in Poland has been one of higher inflation, falling living standards, economic pressure on many people, and that would naturally result in a swing against the government. So, Law and Justice, the government of Poland needs to make some careful calculations, and perhaps, just possibly, they will now start to restrain some of their enthusiasms for an intervention in Ukraine. Now, all of this comes on top of an interesting article in the Washington Post about the Nord Stream bombing, if you could call it that, explosion, sabotage, investigation. And it's a long article, though one that actually, when you unpack it, says extremely little. But two things stood out for me. Firstly, it's quite clear that the six guys and a boat theory about the sabotage of Nord Stream has, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. Apparently, German investigators have become openly skeptical about this entire theory, an absurd theory from the outset. It was too absurd, I think, to be taken seriously, and I think that most people in Germany understand that, and it certainly seems as if the German investigators too. They've examined the yacht Andromeda. The very fact that the residues of explosive that have been found in this yacht exactly match those that were used to blow up the Nord Stream pipelines, apparently is making the Germans suspicious that this is in fact a deliberately planted false lead. And it looks as if, as I said, the entire absurdity of that theory is just too obvious even for the Germans to ignore. But the article went on to say two very interesting things. Firstly, it said that there's widespread reluctance within NATO to discuss the issue of the Nord Stream sabotage. There was a rather colourful comment about how this is like the corpse that's lying around, which everyone pretends not to notice, which is an interesting thing in itself. But the other thing that I noticed about this article is that for the first time in an article that I've seen in mainstream media, and this is, as I said, the Washington Post, but it's clear that it derives from information coming out of Germany. For the first time, somebody in Western mainstream media is speculating on a link to Poland. It's been pointed out that Andromeda, the yacht Andromeda, was owned or leased by a Polish company, and there's some suggestions of a Polish connection. And I can't help but think that this is going to make people some people, or should make some people in Poland, nervous. I don't in fact certainly don't believe that Poland carried out or was involved in this operation by itself. If it did play a role, it would have certainly done so with the support of the United States. There's more and more speculation that Chancellor Scholz of Germany was at least informed in advance of what was going to happen. But the fact, as I said, that Poland is being put in the frame, the very time when there are discussions about sending a peacekeeping force to Ukraine, which can only come from Poland, I have to say it's suggestive. And I have to also say this. I think that if Poland were to do something as foolish as send a peacekeeping force into Ukraine, an intervention force, in other words, into Ukraine, it would not be supported in Germany. I'm not going to explore that further in this program, but I think that German public opinion will absolutely not want to support what they might see as a Polish adventure, a Polish feud with Russia. So I'm just making all of these points. They're just pieces of the jigsaw. I'm not sure how they all fit together. Maybe they don't all fit together. But I did find it interesting that Washington Post article, as I said, for the first time, puts Poland in the frame. Just for clarity, I still believe that the attack on Nord Stream was carried out principally by the United States in the manner discussed by Seymour Hersh, which makes the fact, as I said, that somebody is starting to point a finger a little towards Poland, I find it makes it that fact even more interesting. Now, before I leave all of these discussions, let me just add two quick further points. The first one is this. It's absolutely clear to me that the Russians have been aware of the possibility of an offensive in Zaporozhye region for months before even the Western media started to discuss it. After all, General Surovikin gave an interview soon after he was appointed by President Putin to a senior position, to the temporary position he occupied as overall commander. Though I still believe, by the way, that he's the main theatre commander. Anyway, he was already talking way back, I think in September or early October, about the need to create fortified lines. And that's exactly what the Russians have done. And they started to do that almost immediately in Zaporozhye region. So it looks very much as if the Russians, presumably from intelligence or however they did it, they worked out that the main Ukrainian attack was going to happen in Zaporozhye region. And as I said, people have been talking about how the Russians are dug in and prepared for this offensive. They're dug in and prepared for this offensive because, well, they were aware that it was coming all the way back in October. And that must, to my mind, make the prospects of this offensive problematic. When the Ukrainians launched their successful offensive in Kharkiv region in September, the Russians were, at least to some extent, caught by surprise, and they were not prepared. This time, they are heavily prepared. They are very much more heavily prepared than they were even in relation to the Ukrainian offensive in Kherson in the summer and autumn. They've had months to prepare, and as I said, they've built up these very heavy fortified lines to do it. And the other thing is that today, Putin is apparently chairing an enlarged meeting of Russia's Security Council. We haven't yet had much in the way of information about what that's all about, but it's clear, and we've already been told this, that it is going to be about the war in Ukraine, and presumably this is also connected in some way with preparations for the Ukrainian counteroffensive and for any further advance by the Russians beyond what beyond Bakhmut, once Bakhmut is finally captured. I would add, by the way, that Putin has just visited the important industrial town of Tula, which is not far from Moscow. Tula is another major center of the Russian arms industry. There's heavy armaments and munitions that are carried out there. He went and visited some of the factories in Tula, the arms factories in Tula, and no doubt there'll be discussions about weapons production, arms production in Tula and other places at this at the Security Council meeting. Now, that brings me to another topic, which is the affair of the American journalist, the arrested U.S. journalist who was, of course, recently arrested, Ivan Gershkovich, who was recently arrested in Yekaterinburg on spying charges by the Russians. The Russians have just confirmed that they have also arrested some other two Russian citizens also on spying charges in Yekaterinburg, the same place where Gershkovich was arrested. And this is the report we've had from TASS. A married couple have been detained for spying for Ukraine at a defense sector enterprise in Nizhny Tagil and have confessed to handing over blueprints to Ukrainian special services in exchange for $1,270, according to a video of their interrogation released by the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, on Tuesday. And I wonder whether these two arrests are in some of Gershkovich and of this particular couple are in some way connected, not in the sense of Gershkovich being part of some kind of spying operation involving these people, this couple, but just possibly, just conceivably, to the Russian counter-espionage services, the fact that a US journalist was in Yekaterinburg asking questions about apparently tank production at Nizhny Tagil, at the Ural-Vagon Zavod factory, and also about Kalibr cruise missile production at the Novator factory, which is also located in Yekaterinburg. That's at least the rumor. At the same time that a Russian couple were apparently being paid by Ukrainian special services to provide blueprints of something that is being produced in Nizhny Tagil. T-90M tanks, perhaps? Who knows? I wonder whether the Russian special services felt that there is some kind of connection and that it's perhaps not just a coincidence that these two events, this journalist, this American journalist, asking those questions, and this Ukrainian intelligence operation were going on at the same time. Anyway, just saying. And anyway, we will see. We will see how all of this develops, but no doubt there'll be a discussion. I suspect there will be a discussion of this at the Security Council meeting that Putin is about to chair. And I think it is highly likely that the topic of Gershkovich and what to do with him will also be discussed there. About that, I'm not sure. And if it is discussed, most probably we won't be publicly informed about it. It will be something that will be discussed on the sidelines of this very big meeting. Now, I'm going to finish with this program today with another topic, and it's a big topic, and it's about Russian relations with India. And this all comes now from a series of tweets by the former Indian diplomat, M.K. Badrakumar. I've discussed him many times. He's an outstanding blogger. He writes a fascinating website about international relations. But on this occasion, he specifically focused on certain recent events relating to relations between India and Russia. And I'm going to read these tweets. They all follow sequentially upon each other. And they've all been published, by the way, over the last day. They date from the 4th of April. The Modi government apparently got a heads up on the OPEC oil cut. The OPEC decision to cut supply by 1 million barrels per day came just 3 days after Russia's oil tsar, Igor Sechin, one of Putin's closest aides, came to Delhi on a day-long visit to conclude a term agreement on Wednesday. Now, Igor Sechin is an extremely important individual. He is the chief executive officer of Rosneft, Russia's biggest oil company by far, and a state-owned oil company. He's particularly close to Putin. He's also somebody, by the way, with a background in Russia's intelligence and security service. So he's somebody who's close to Putin. He's a powerful man in Russia, both politically and in terms of his central role in the oil industry. He is in some ways, and in many respects, the key figure in the oil industry in Russia today. And he has just visited Delhi, and he went there to agree an important agreement, and he did that 3 days before the announcement of the oil production cut. And I ought to say that there's now been confirmation that on the eve of the production cut, the Russian and Saudi oil ministers apparently had discussions, so the Russians were indeed kept fully informed and presumably were in agreement with this production cut. Anyway, to continue with what Badrakumar says, details have not been divulged, but the pact will now buffet Indian economy from expected volatility in the global oil market. Petroleum Minister A.H. Puri's presence at the signing ceremony, according to the Rosneft press release, hinted at high-level political decision. Most certainly, Sechin met Puri. So we have a meeting. Sechin meets Puri. He's India's petroleum minister. He attended the signing ceremony, and it's apparently intended The plan is that Russia will supply oil to India, but it will be at a stable price. It will protect India from volatility in terms of shifts, dramatic upward shifts in oil prices, which many people are expecting over the course of this year. And then Patrushev goes on to say this. Interestingly, Russia's security Tsar, Nikolai Patrushev, also happened to be in Delhi on the same day as Sechin at Ajit Doval's. Ajit Doval is Modi's national security advisor's invitation, and was received by Prime Minister Modi. So Patrushev, Putin's national security advisor, secretary of Russia's Security Council, top body which is going to be meeting today. Patrushev, who also, by the way, supervises the work of the Russian intelligence community. He was in India together with Sechin when Sechin agreed this deal with India, this oil deal with India. Almost certainly they travelled together, probably on the same aircraft, that's just a guess. And Patrushev had a meeting with Modi himself. And then Batrukuma finishes. Russia has put a firewall around India in troubled times, with troubled times ahead in the oil market as the United States crosses swords with Saudi Arabia. Now, this is all very interesting. And I have to say, all sorts of pieces, as I said, are moving into place. We've seen China playing a big role over the last few weeks, with Xi Jinping in Moscow and Wang Yi before that in Munich. By the way, on that topic, of China, Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen are now in Beijing. They're going to meet Xi Jinping. No doubt I will be talking about that in my next program. But anyway, in the meantime, even as all that is going on, we see the Indians also busy at work. And they've just hosted these two powerful men of the Russian leadership, Patrushev, Russia's intelligence Tsar, Putin's national security advisor, the very powerful head of Russia's secretary of Russia's Security Council, one of the key decision makers in Russia, alongside Igor Sechin, perhaps the pivotal figure in Russia's oil industry. And they've come and Patrushev says that Russia has placed this firewall around India's energy industry, so that India, whatever happens, prices go up, prices go down, India is guaranteed stable supplies of oil from Russia. And of course, this isn't something that just happens. There's some kind of a larger framework behind all of this. I'm not saying there's been a direct deal done. No doubt, of course, the Indians are going to use more rupees, pay more in rupees for Russian oil, all that kind of thing. But the fact that Modi is meeting with Patrushev suggests some kind of security dimension to all of this as well. Now, all of this, of course, comes shortly after Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow. It seems to me at least plausible that along with all of these meetings, Patrushev will have been briefing Modi about the discussions that took place between Putin and Xi Jinping. And there's growing sense that perhaps at some point over the next few months, the Indians and the Chinese might start to get together as well. I've discussed in previous programs how disillusioned the Indians are becoming with their relationship with the United States, the way in which the United States seems intent, for example, on wrecking the G20 summit meeting due to happen in Delhi in September by insisting on condemnation of Russia at that meeting, which the Indians say isn't going to happen given that Russia is a member of the G20. But anyway, there's a sense that the Indians are becoming exasperated by this relationship and that they might be seeking at some point to mend their fences with China. And there was, of course, a discussion of this on our latest live stream with Jeffrey Sachs yesterday. He's just been to Delhi and he's just been to Beijing, and he thinks it's possible that the Indians and the Chinese are going to make some move towards each other over the next few weeks and months, one which is going to stun the United States if it does indeed happen. Anyway, one does wonder whether this meeting between Modi and Patrushev was in part all about that. Anyway, lots of questions, answers still thin on the ground. We shouldn't speculate too much based on too few facts, but the direction of travel, the shift in Indian policy, all of that, it seems to me, all the facts about that are becoming increasingly clear. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. We'll see what happens with this Ukrainian offensive, if it happens over the next few days. We'll see what happens in Bakhmut. And we'll see what happens with Macron and Ursula von der Leyen in Beijing. That'll be for my next program. In the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day, to remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram, links under this video. You can also find us you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop and the great merchandise that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.